Deep down, many parents harbor a quiet sorrow that they rarely bring to the surface. It's the realization that their children, once the center of their universe, defenseless and in need of constant care, have grown up and changed. Over time, not only does their appearance change, but also their attitude towards those who dedicated their lives to them. Perhaps this feeling is familiar to you. Like many mothers and fathers, you may have dedicated your life to raising your children, sacrificing nights of sleep to ease their illnesses, postponing your own plans to meet their needs, sacrificing words to maintain peace in the family. You did everything possible and even impossible to provide them with the best possible future. And now, when all you desire is to be heard and respected, you encounter coldness, indifference, and even contempt. Your attempts to give advice are interrupted. Your revelations are ignored. Sometimes you are corrected, as if all your life experience has been devalued. And then the logical question arises: where was the mistake made? At this moment, there is a desire to earn respect, to remind them of all the sacrifices, and to demand recognition. However, these efforts often prove futile, and the pain turns into resentment. The desire for closeness is replaced by disappointment and alienation. Confucius, an outstanding thinker in human history, once remarked, "A river that excessively squanders its waters turns into a dirty stream. A father who constantly yields in everything seems to dissolve into the depths of the earth." There is profound wisdom in these words. By sacrificing oneself to maintain attachment, one involuntarily accustoms others to forget about one's value. This happens not out of malice, but rather due to the human tendency to value what is always available, rather than simply kindness. However, contrary to popular belief, lost respect can be regained. And most importantly, this process does not depend on changes in the children's behavior. It all starts with self-awareness and working on oneself. Yes, even now it is possible to influence how children perceive their parents, to earn their respect without shouting, reproaches, or humiliation. The key to change lies in changing one's own attitude towards oneself, in regaining a sense of self-worth. What follows are 7 principles inspired by the wisdom of Confucius that can transform the relationship between parent and children. These are 7 steps that require action not from the children, but from the parent themselves. These teachings are not just a set of tips, but deep truths, simple in form, but possessing enormous power. If one decides to embark on this path, they may find that the respect that seemed lost forever is actually only dormant, waiting for the moment when they remember their true value and significance. It is about returning to the origins, to the personality that existed before going into the shadows, before voluntarily giving up one's own voice, before the mistaken belief that love is synonymous with all forgiveness, even in the face of disrespectful behavior. There will be an understanding that silence can be both a manifestation of wisdom and a submissive agreement with injustice. Giving oneself to others is certainly noble, but self-sacrifice without reciprocity leads to exhaustion. One will remember that taking care of one's own interests is not selfishness, but a worthy example to follow. And most importantly, it will become clear that restoring harmony in relationships is possible not through ultimatums, but through the unspoken authority of a self-respecting person. So, having mustered the courage, it is worth moving on to the first stage of revival. Stage 1. Stop seeking approval. For a long time, there was a belief that the desire to please is a reliable way to maintain the love of one's children. And this is quite understandable, because from the moment they were born, parents constantly took care of their well-being, providing everything necessary. Over time, this care evolved into a kind of unconditional reflex to satisfy the needs of children, even if it is detrimental to one's own mental balance. The desire to be an understanding parent, to avoid conflicts, to concede in minor issues, and then, in more serious ones, to forgive mistakes, to turn a blind eye to rudeness and disrespect. All this was done in the name of love. However, no one warned, or perhaps chose not to notice, that constant attempts to please undermine authority, albeit imperceptibly, but tangibly. The feeling of mental anguish arises from the realization that you are moving away from the principles that inspire respect. After all, respect grows from harmony, not from blind obedience. It blossoms where clear boundaries are established, where there is firmness of spirit. When only all-forgiving acceptance is offered, even when faced with blatant disrespect, the thought is involuntarily instilled that you do not deserve serious treatment. The wise Confucius once said, "He who craves universal recognition risks dissolving in this aspiration." Perhaps that is exactly what happened. Gradually, in an effort to be an understanding parent, one ceases to be a reliable guide, losing their significance. They turn into someone who constantly yields, agrees with everything, smiles even when their heart is breaking. But this is not inevitable. It is always possible to remain firm without resorting to aggression. You can show love without becoming submissive. You can love and stand your ground at the same time. It's not about being overly harsh or raising your voice. On the contrary, firmness that inspires. True respect is usually silent. It is quiet and calm. It begins with the ability to say a firm no when it is truly necessary, with refusing to engage in behavior that causes pain, with not constantly making excuses and not feeling guilty for expressing disagreement. It is natural to wonder, will my increased insistence lead to even more distance from my children? This question worries many parents, and these fears are not unfounded. However, it is worth facing the truth. If children distance themselves because a parent has taken a firm and dignified stance, you should not blame yourself. Rather, it is a reflection of an established pattern of behavior that has gone unchanged for too long and is now being challenged. And most importantly, if the relationship is based on genuine love, then alienation will only be temporary. After all, children who experience true attachment, even with initial dissatisfaction, ultimately begin to admire parents who value themselves and their boundaries. You can start with simple but important statements. I deserve respectful treatment. I will not accept this kind of reaction. I prefer to discuss this when we are both calm. After that, remain silent. Do not go into explanations. Do not make excuses, and do not back down from your position. This change in behavior may initially cause discomfort, but over time it will gain immense strength. Children gradually realize that the parent has stopped seeking approval and has begun to act as an individual who is aware of their own worth. It often happens that parents who strive for universal love and approval risk being forgotten by their children. At the same time, parents who demonstrate firmness and principles, even if it causes temporary rejection, eventually earn deep respect. The fact is that the memory of descendants does not retain the image of a person who is ready to make any concessions, but a strong personality who has their own opinion and voice. It is important to remember your identity, not to waste energy on pointless excuses and the struggle for recognition. Genuine respect begins from the moment a person stops trying to please everyone and begins to live with a sense of self-worth. The next important step is to teach children by example, not to engage in fruitless arguments with them. When we encounter disrespect, there is a natural desire to explain our position, make excuses, and prove our point. After everything that has been done for the children, it seems fair to expect them to at least listen attentively and respect their words. However, when children interrupt, confront, or show indifference, there is a temptation to force them to understand their point of view. Parents begin to argue, shout, and persuade, but the wise Confucius once said, "He who raises his voice to be heard has already lost his authority." There is age-old truth in these reflections. True respect is not born in verbal battles. It cannot be erected by arguments of reason or pressure of voice. It grows out of posture, out of manner, out of a silent example. Probably everyone has encountered a similar situation. A parent calls a child for a conversation, trying to calmly state their position, but at some point the dialogue turns into a polemic. And before you know it, sarcastic remarks are made, the defense of one's own borders begins, desperate attempts to prove one's rightness. As a result, neither side wins, and mutual understanding only evaporates. The reason is that the younger generation is often not ready to listen to instructions, especially when it seems to them that they are being imposed with someone else's point of view. And the more insistent the attempts to persuade, the stronger the resistance becomes. Children seem to close their ears and hearts, hardening in their righteousness. It is much more effective to simply demonstrate by example, without excessive moralizing, without barbed phrases, without an obsessive desire to correct, but simply to live in accordance with your beliefs, remaining calm, taking care of yourself, and remaining attentive to others, but not imposing your will. Over time, this approach forms something much more significant than any debate. It creates a moral compass. Children may not share their parents' views, but they cannot ignore their consistency. They may not listen to words, but they cannot fail to notice their dignity. And dignity is not something shouted in the squares. It is embodied in life itself. Legend has it that in one village lived an elder named Han, who had earned the reputation of a wise parent. However, over time, his grown children began to show disrespect, mocking the established traditions he revered. At first, Han tried to reason with them, resorting to exhortations and even angry outbursts, exclaiming in his heart, "Have you forgotten all my sacrifices for your benefit?" But one day, weary of fruitless attempts, he fell silent, not harboring resentment, but finding inner peace. Han focused on a simple life, tending the garden, indulging in reflections, and writing down his thoughts, listening attentively to others without interrupting, and observing what was happening without passing judgment. And over time, a surprising transformation occurred in his children. They gradually began to gravitate towards their father, showing interest in his life, asking questions, and listening carefully to his answers, remembering the old days. In his silence, Han found something lost, a presence of mind that evoked genuine respect without the need for words. This phenomenon became known as learning by example. It is not always necessary to react to every provocation or correct every mistake. You should not constantly remind others of your achievements and sacrifices. It is much more important to live with dignity, take care of yourself, be true to your promises, and remain calm even in a tense situation. This is the essence of silent leadership, when personal example becomes a powerful tool for influence and inspiration. Silence is not a sign of powerlessness. The silence of a person who has found harmony with himself sounds louder than any cry, for it testifies to self-sufficiency, to the absence of a need for proof. Over time, children realize this as well. They will see that actions speak more convincingly than learned words, and inner peace is stronger than any speech. And then the parent will teach them the most important lesson. Respect is not begged for. It is earned by the strength of a personality living in peace with itself. The next stage is getting rid of emotional dependence. Realizing the estrangement of children is one of the most painful experiences for parents. Silence, indifference, and rare meetings become increasingly unbearable. Calls and visits become less frequent, messages shorter, and expressions of affection more meager. The parent begins to catch themselves waiting for a call or invitation. This expectation becomes a burden, creating a feeling that all the given strength, love, and care remain unanswered. This is how emotional dependence is born. Such attachment is not a conscious choice, but rather an insidious process that gradually takes hold of a person when their existence begins to be entirely determined by the expected reaction of others. When an individual places their significance in direct dependence on the opinions of others, when they are convinced that only recognition and love from the outside can make them complete, they, sometimes unconsciously, put themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. They begin to live not for their own goals and aspirations, but for ephemeral external approval. The wise Confucius once said, "He who craves applause will die in silence." This profound thought encourages us to turn to our inner world, to realize that we can endlessly love our children without turning them into the meaning of our existence. We can love them sincerely and devotedly without depending on their presence or opinion. We can desire their closeness, but not fall into despair in separation. We can miss them while maintaining a sense of self-worth and self-sufficiency. The problem lies not in the feelings themselves, but in the danger of dissolving in them, of losing oneself. It is about building a life so focused on the role of the parent that when children, like birds, leave the nest, there remains only a gaping void that is extremely difficult to fill. However, even this void can be transformed, filling it with new meaning and content. In the life of every mother, there comes a moment when children leave the parental home, embarking on an independent journey. Yulin's story is a prime example. For a long time, she dissolved in caring for her children, putting their interests above all else. Years passed. The children grew up and started their own families and concerns, and Yulin remained alone in an empty house full of memories. Every Sunday, as usual, she set the table, brewed fragrant tea, set the plates, but the invited guests were in no hurry to come to the threshold, and every such Sunday became a painful reminder of loneliness. But one day a turning point occurred in Yulin's heart. It was not an explosion of indignation or resentment, but rather a manifestation of love and care for herself. She decided to change her life, filling it with new colors and experiences. Yulin began to go on exciting hikes, enrolled in painting courses, where she happily plunged into the world of art and resumed communication with her friends from her youth. Visiting the literary club was a real discovery for her. And then something amazing happened. Yulin's children returned, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of a calling of the heart. They saw that their mother, who seemed so fragile and dependent, had regained her inner strength and confidence. A spark of life shone in her eyes, attracting them like a magnet. This is the main secret. When a person ceases to depend on others, they begin to inspire. They become a source of light and positive energy, attracting those around them. People are drawn to them not out of pity or a sense of duty, but out of a sincere desire to be near. And even if the children don't return in the way they would like, the person will maintain peace of mind, because they have rediscovered a priceless gift, emotional independence, which does not depend on anyone's opinion or presence. It's not about building impregnable walls around your heart, but about tempering it, giving it strength. This is not a call to abandon love, but a call to love consciously, without placing the responsibility for creating the fullness of your own life on another person. It is natural to feel nostalgia and crave closeness. These are integral features of human nature, but personal well-being should not be a hostage to someone else's attitude. Everyone deserves happiness that comes from within, deserves a joyful awakening and a reason to smile, regardless of phone calls. Everyone deserves a sense of wholeness and self-sufficiency. When life is filled with useful activities, communication with inspiring people, and practices that bring satisfaction, the world around you is transformed. Perhaps the changes will affect the children, and perhaps not, but the person will no longer depend on their reaction, and this is true freedom, emotional independence, in which genuine respect flourishes. One of the most difficult challenges for people with big hearts is the ability to say enough, set boundaries, and monitor their compliance, especially when it comes to their own children. From the very beginning, they have an innate desire to give without reservation, time, energy, care, wise advice, material goods, and even silence, driven by good intentions, pride, but also an underlying fear, the fear of being rejected, appearing too strict, and losing touch with loved ones. Because of this all-consuming fear of conflict, a person is often willing to compromise even in the most minor situations. A lenient attitude towards a sharp tone, barbed answers, and contempt, skillfully disguised as a joke, becomes commonplace. Disrespect, justified by the phrase, "it's his path," gradually becomes a habit. And before a person realizes what is happening, they begin to accept what previously seemed absolutely unacceptable. This process begins with silent concessions, when a person submissively agrees with the lack of attention and swallows offensive words just to avoid a quarrel. The aggression that they prefer to ignore in order not to provoke a conflict becomes a breeding ground for disrespect. After all, as Confucius wisely noted, an undefended boundary invites a conqueror. If a person does not show others where the line is that cannot be crossed, then they, even without malicious intent, begin to perceive permissiveness as a given. Setting boundaries is not a way to push people away, but rather an act of nurturing and protecting relationships from toxic influence. It is a demonstration that true love is impossible without mutual respect. It is important to remember that boundaries are not set in a fit of anger. They must be clearly defined and consistently maintained in order to create a healthy and harmonious atmosphere in relationships. Surely each of us has had to deal with unfair reproaches, caustic taunts, or even outright rudeness. Remember how often you had to restrain your resentment, listening to harsh words or unfounded accusations. It is especially painful when this comes from your own children, who allow themselves a tone that is unacceptable in communication with parents. However, before giving in to anger or resentment, it is worth asking yourself, what has been done to prevent this from happening? Perhaps the lack of a clear position is the reason for the current situation. It's not about scandals and screams, but about firmness and the ability to defend your boundaries. Sometimes one look into the eyes, full of dignity and confidence, and a phrase spoken in a calm but firm voice is enough. I deserve respectful treatment. And, of course, words must be backed up by actions. I am reminded of the story of René, a man who had accumulated the wisdom of many years and was accustomed to silent patience. One day, when his son rudely interrupted him, René calmly said, "I speak to those who listen to me. When you are ready to listen, I will speak to you again." And he fell silent, not for an hour, not for a day, but for several long days. Without reproaches, without resentment, he simply remained true to his decision. And when his son finally returned, something had changed in his eyes. He saw before him not just a parent, but a person worthy of respect. Boundaries do not distance people from each other. On the contrary, they define the framework of relationships, structure them, and teach respect. At the beginning of the journey of defending one's boundaries, resistance, surprise, and perhaps temporary estrangement are inevitable. But all of this is just a stage in the process of emotional growth, necessary for forming healthy and harmonious relationships. In relationships with others, especially with loved ones, the ability to establish and maintain personal boundaries plays a key role. It is not enough to simply define them once or plead for them to be respected. It is necessary to persistently, confidently, and methodically defend one's space, guided not by stubbornness, but by a sense of self-worth. Children who experience genuine affection, even if hidden, will eventually learn to respect the established boundaries. Those who lack this feeling should not become the center of your attention. If circumstances develop in such a way that attempts to get closer lead to alienation, do not blame yourself. After all, relationships devoid of mutual respect are, in essence, already a form of alienation, even in physical presence. A person is not created to be a silent wall, taking on other people's emotional blows. True love, capable of healing emotional wounds, begins with the realization of the right not to accept what causes pain. Firmness in defending one's boundaries is not equal to cruelty. It is a manifestation of clarity that heals relationships wounded by conflict. Loved ones should understand what actions are unacceptable, not to feel limited, but to learn to treat you with due respect. The fifth step on the path to harmony with oneself is to stop squandering oneself without due recognition. A generous gift be it time, support in a difficult moment, wise advice, or financial assistance, has always been an act of the highest virtue. Parental love, from the moment of the first embrace, serves as a prime example of such self-sacrifice. True love implies generosity, complete dedication to another. However, it is important to realize that not every act of generosity meets with deserved recognition. Worse, when generosity becomes the norm, predictable and not requiring reflection, it ceases to be perceived as a gift, turning into a kind of duty. It is at this moment that many parents feel empty. It's not about the fading of love, but about the fatigue from constant giving without finding a response. Extending a helping hand, they face only a consumerist attitude. They are overtaken in the desire to please, but do not bother to express gratitude. They share their last, open their souls, and in return hear only reproaches and criticism. However bitter it may be to admit, the fact remains. The more you give without receiving gratitude, the more you accustom others to neglect. The wise saying of Confucius states, "That which is offered in abundance without appreciation loses its value and turns into a deficiency." Not only is the one who accepts the undeserved blameworthy, but also the one who, blinded by pride, does not realize this. The truth is that true love requires nothing in return, and feelings can be limitless, but actions must be reasonable. Love in a mature understanding knows boundaries. Endless giving without a response, without gratitude and exchange, turns from generosity into a form of self-deprecation. Once in a family circle, the son blurted out the phrase, "It's his duty. He's not busy with anything else anyway." These words pierced the father's heart like the tip of a dagger. At that moment, he realized how generosity had turned into expectation, care had become routine, and a gift had become an obligation. It was then that a transformation occurred, not out of malice, but out of awareness. He began to say, "I am ready to help when I see your efforts, when I feel recognition and respect." Surprisingly, the children began to listen to him, not out of fear of losing material support, but because for the first time they saw their father putting his interests first, which caused them a feeling of respect. There is a widespread misconception that to win love, it is necessary to tirelessly give, even when faced with ingratitude. True love is built on other principles. Giving should be selfless, stem from inner balance, be an act of generosity of soul, but also of reason. It is important to assess to whom the help is addressed and how it is perceived. Changes are inevitable, and in this case, they are for the better. A transformation has taken place in a person who realizes the value of their resources and the need for a selective approach to their distribution. Before responding to a request, you should pay attention to the tone of the request and the presence of gratitude. In the absence of such, you must find the courage to refuse. Those who truly love will understand this decision, and those who do not love probably never appreciated selfless gifts. The core idea is that a person is not an inexhaustible resource. Every individual has limitations, is subject to fatigue, and possesses desires and needs. If those around them don't take this into account, it's necessary to assert one's own boundaries. Giving is commendable, but giving without reciprocity means losing oneself. And since too much has already been given, it's time to replenish the deficit of respect for one's own personality. The sixth step towards harmony with oneself is creating a fulfilling life beyond parental duties. It's quite possible to find oneself in a situation where caring for children overshadows all other aspects of existence. Initially driven by good intentions and a desire to protect their offspring, parents gradually push their own interests into the background. Sacrificing personal aspirations for the well-being of their children, they abandon their own desires and preferences. At a certain stage, this approach seems justified and even noble. However, time is relentless. Children grow up, leave the nest, and build their own families. And then the parent finds themselves in a situation where their heart is still attached to the past, to a lifestyle that is no longer relevant. The expectation of visits, calls, and attention becomes obsessive, and their absence generates a feeling of abandonment and emptiness. The wise words of Confucius, spoken many centuries ago, remain relevant today. The father who revolves around his children stifles them, but the one who revolves around his own life inspires them. Love that turns into dependence deprives both parent and child of freedom. Children, no matter how much they love their parents, should not fill the entire space of their lives. Acknowledging this fact can be painful, but many parents continue to live for their children even when they have grown up and are living their own lives. The lack of constant contact with children leads to a loss of meaning in life and a sense of loss. However, such an approach is unfair both to oneself and to the children. Everyone has the right to a fulfilling life, independent of the attention of others, a life filled with their own interests, friends, joys, and hobbies. Children leaving the parental home often leaves a woman alone. The first years after this event can turn into an endless series of expectations, calls, visits, signs of attention. However, this expectation, unsupported by reality, creates sadness, which in turn can lead to deep silence. In such a situation, a woman is able to change her life. She can sign up for ceramics courses, return to a forgotten passion for Chinese painting. Daily walks in the park can open up new acquaintances with women experiencing a similar stage in life. Gradually, a smile appears on her face and a sparkle in her eyes. Surprisingly, it is these changes that attract the attention of the children, who begin to visit their mother more often, inquiring about her new activities and friends. They strive to see her because she has once again become an interesting person. Having transformed from a person living in expectation to a person enjoying life, she inspires admiration. Building one's own life after the children have left home does not mean alienation from them. It is, first of all, a manifestation of respect for oneself, a demonstration to the children and to oneself that life continues, that there are one's own interests, joys, and discoveries. This choice does not require radical changes. Sometimes a small decision is enough: to return to a favorite activity, to meet with an old acquaintance for a cup of coffee, to start writing, walking, learning new things, doing something just for pleasure, something that belongs only to her. Over time, it becomes clear that to feel fulfilled in life, one does not need to depend on others. Time can be generous if used wisely. Silence, filled with pleasant activities and thoughts, ceases to be synonymous with loneliness, turning into peace. Realization may not come immediately, but changes will certainly be noticed by those around you. And even if external recognition does not follow, the inner satisfaction from a life built not on empty expectations, but on conscious choices, will be the reward. The status of parent will remain unchanged, but it should not overshadow other facets of personality. Everyone deserves recognition of their integrity and uniqueness. Love for children is a wonderful feeling, but love for oneself is no less important. A life filled with meaning, joy, and presence in the moment becomes a source of inspiration for others. Respect in this case arises not from demands, but from sincere admiration. The seventh step on the path to oneself is forgiveness, which does not mean self-denial. The deepest and most agonizing pain is that inflicted by loved ones. An offense from a stranger is quickly forgotten, but a wound inflicted by a child who was raised in love and care has a special weight. Harsh words, rejection, ingratitude, coldness, contempt, lack of recognition, all of this may seem like a trifle from the outside, but for the person experiencing it within, it becomes a real ordeal. And then, with wisdom and parental love, a deep breath is taken, and forgiveness occurs. Not out of weakness, but out of understanding that resentment is a destructive force. Forgiveness becomes a way to break the vicious circle of negativity and move on. Forgiveness grants freedom, promotes spiritual healing, and brings peace. It is important to understand that forgiveness is not self-denial. To forgive does not mean pretending that nothing happened or allowing oneself to be wounded again. It also does not mean remaining in a situation where you are treated without respect, in the naive hope of change. Confucius wisely noted, "To forgive is to throw away the stone, but avoid stepping on the thorn again." These words contain a deep truth. Forgiveness should be an act of liberation, not a sign of submission. It is quite possible to sincerely forgive a person while setting boundaries. You can wish another well while protecting and defending yourself. Unfortunately, many parents mistakenly believe that forgiveness obliges them to endure everything. They continue to face neglect, insults, and exploitation, justifying it with family ties and hoping for an improvement in the situation. However, instead of reconciliation, this leads to self-denial and loss of one's own identity. True forgiveness does not require self-torture to maintain a connection. It calls for healing and a subsequent conscious decision about what to keep and what to change in the relationship. There is a story about a man named Liang, whose son showed striking indifference for many years. The relationship between them was marred by constant demands, impatience, and criticism from the son. Liang, showing incredible patience, forgave his offspring time after time, invariably repeating, "He will understand." However, time passed, and changes never came. And then, one day, Liang decided to change his approach. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter that contained no reproaches or complaints. Instead, he tried to explain his feelings to his son, told him about the mental pain he had to endure, and about his tireless attempts to save their relationship. The letter contained words of tender but firm resolve. "I forgive you everything, but I can no longer pretend that it doesn't hurt me." After handing the letter to his son, Liang took a conscious step back, ceasing to impose himself and be always available. It was then that his son first felt the absence of his father not as punishment, but as a valuable lesson. After a few months, he returned a completely different person, more humble, more open to communication. These changes did not occur because the father demanded them, but because he finally made it clear that he also needed to be cared for. This is the great power of forgiveness, which is born from awareness. It does not destroy bridges, but it does not allow them to be crossed unhindered. A person does not need to build impregnable walls or live in a state of constant conflict, but it is important to remember oneself, that one also deserves respect, that one's pain matters, and that one's story has value. Liberation from the guilt of another person and getting rid of one's own mental pain is a noble act, but it should not mean a return to the old relationship. Forgiveness requires change from both the forgiver and the forgiven. In cases where positive changes do not occur, the wisest manifestation of love becomes distance. Maintaining a certain distance is a manifestation of respect, a demonstration that love has not faded, but that one's sense of self-worth has not been sacrificed. A person is capable of combining compassion and firmness, generosity and principle. He can be open to hugs without bowing his head. Forgiveness is not the end, but the beginning of a new stage. However, this new start only makes sense if both parties are actively involved. Perhaps reflections on forgiveness have awakened memories of moments when you had to face indifference, when you desperately wanted to be noticed, but your efforts remained in vain, of words that caused pain, and of silence that hurt even more. Perhaps there is an awareness of how much effort was spent, how much was given, how sincerely it was believed that love was enough to deserve respect. However, the truth is that love is only fertile soil, and respect is the seed that needs to be planted in it. And like any seed, respect requires space, care, and firmness to sprout. Respect is not born of submission and does not grow out of persistence. It blossoms only when a loving person shows respect in return. There is no need for a radical transformation of the younger generation, nor for their transformation, in order to return lost meaning to one's own life. The primary task is self-discovery, finding your own voice, realizing your own significance, and taking your rightful place, which may have been forgotten in the bustle of days. Reconnecting with yourself does not require forceful measures, but only the presence of a person who is aware of their own worth, does not need constant excuses and proofs, and does not tolerate disrespectful treatment disguised as love. You can start this journey immediately, gradually abandoning the search for approval and moving on to teaching by your own example, rather than words. You should stop languishing in anticipation and start building a life that brings satisfaction, establishing and maintaining personal boundaries, conscious generosity, rather than a sense of duty, and living for yourself, not just for others, become the cornerstones of a new reality. And, importantly, you need to learn to forgive completely, without allowing yourself to burn in the fire of resentment. All these changes happen gradually, without haste or guilt, since it is not about alienation from children, but about getting closer to yourself. When this happens, the world around you is transformed. Children who seem distant begin to show interest. Relationships are rebuilt, and a voice that was previously ignored becomes audible not because of a scream, but because of an awareness of one's own essence. The wise Confucius once uttered a profound truth. He who steadfastly follows the path of truth and justice does not need to obsessively seek followers. His virtue and unwavering honesty in themselves evoke deep respect in the hearts of those around him. Let this inspiring thought be your compass and guiding star on your life path.